Hi, welcome back to La Belle Vie, our law and crime content. So for the Murdaugh case, I went through the prosecution's timeline, very comprehensive timeline that we were provided on Friday. And I went through that and I discovered three different aspects of the timeline that don't really match up to the story we've heard thus far from Alec Murdaugh. So we'll go through those three issues. I also found two aspects of the timeline testimony that the prosecution seemed to really focus on, but I'm not quite sure it's going to be as critical as maybe the prosecution would like us to think. So thanks again for joining. Let's start with a nice brief overview of what this timeline shows us and how comprehensive it is. So right now I'm going to insert a clip that shows you the background of all of the information that's in the timeline so you can get a feel, if you didn't get a chance to see the testimony, so you can get a feel of what's in it. All right, here we go.
All right, and has your name on it, correct?
That's correct.
All right, and then we have a reference guide right here, and if you would just explain just some of the various sources of information that have been admitted before this jury that you ultimately synthesize into this summary timeline.
Okay. What we have here is we're going to have cell bright extraction report. It's going to be for Paul Murdaugh, which as you go through this timeline, PM is going to refer to Paul Murdaugh. We're going to have AM, which is going to be Alex Murdaugh's cell phone extraction, and then MM, which is going to be Maggie Murdaugh. So anytime you see the abbreviations, that's what it's going to refer to. We have their cell phone extractions here. We also have the FBI telemetry report. We have the FBI CAS data. We also have different reports from the phones, like the Axiom reports. We have an ALPR report in here, which is actually probably not in the condensed one. That's going to be automated license plate reader data for Maggie Murdaugh's Mercedes. We're also going to have some Snapchat data, and then data from Rogan Gibson, Paul Murdaugh, Alex Murdaugh, Maggie Murdaugh, and Buster Murdaugh's CDRs, which is the call data records from Verizon.
Let me pause you real quick. So we have extractions. Tell the difference to the jury, and I don't mean to point out with the stick, between an extraction and then CDRs or cell data records, please.
So the extraction is going to be what, like Britt Dove testified, what he actually extract out of the phone. And then the CDRs is going to be what Verizon testified, which is going to be their records of phone calls and text messages. So two separate data sources from two separate entities.
All right, and continue on, please, with the remainder of the data in your summary timeline.
We have referenced here a couple different, like Knowledge C database. That's kind of like the Axiom database. It's just another database that was, records were provided to me from. We also have a PMPED building access log, and then in the big timeline we have the 911 recordings, and then just want to point out a Dylan Hightower extraction. That would have been the first phone extraction of Alex's phone 2 days after the 7th.
Right.
And then we have the GM OnStar data.
Okay.
So as you can see, the timeline is super comprehensive, and I'm so glad that the prosecution gave us this information. So let's get to the first discrepancy that I found, and this relates to the testimony of when Alec and Paul arrived back at the Moselle property on the evening of the murders, and Alec's story of when they arrived, and more specifically, how much time they were, quote, messing around. So I'll start first with the timeline testimony, and then I'll show what Alex said about that. Here we go.
248, and at 6:42:54, we show the Suburban arrives at 4147 Moselle Road based on the GM OnStar data.
All right, and going on to page 6, is that the your CAS map reflecting that data point you just described?
That is correct. It's going to be the 6:42:54 data point.
And what happens at that moment?
That's when Alex Murdaugh is going to arrive back from the PMPED law firm from work that day.
What happens at 7:04?
7:04, through the catch data database, it shows that Paul Murdaugh is at the residence of 4147 Moselle Road. 7:14:13 to 7:22:19 it's going to be Paul Murdaugh's iPhone showing approximately 208 steps traveled during that time period. And the one below it's going to be 7:15:35 to 7:21:52. This is going to be from Alex's phone, showing that approximately 200 steps were taken during that time frame. So we have 208 steps taken from Paul during his time frame, and then Alex is around 200 steps traveled.
And both those time periods for those steps for Alec and Paul, are those generally roughly the same?
Generally the same.
Consistent?
That's correct. Testimony, you've seen this this video. This is just a thumbnail picture, and this is when it's showing it was created in Paul Murdaugh's phone. And we have a little screenshot of the creation time. It's going to show 7:39:55 is when this thumbnail was created in Paul's phone.
And remind the jury what video that is. Let's say we got a thumbnail there, but
Yep.
what video is that?
This is going to be that Snapchat video that was sent to a few friends of the tree. You have Alex Murdaugh in the tree that's leaning over.
All right, and again, this is when that video, at least the timestamp, was its creation?
That's correct, based on previous testimony, yes.
All right, below that, 7:55 time period, we have two entries. Can you explain those two entries to the jury and how they relate to each other, if anything?
So 7:55:44 to 8:05:28, we have Paul Murdaugh's iPhone showing approximately 262 steps traveled. And a close time frame from 7:55:32 to 8:05:07, we show Alex's iPhone traveling approximately 270 steps during that time period.
And then at 7:56, what is reflected as it relates to that Snapchat video?
This is when the Snapchat video referencing Alex Murdaugh would have been sent through Paul's Snapchat account to his friends, based on previous testimony.
And it was created, you already testified to this, but it was created when?
I believe 7:39:55.
And it was sent out to his friends when?
At 7:56 p.m.
Time in the afternoon.
You know, I would think it'd be somewhere in the 5 o'clock range, a little bit. It was broad daylight when we were, it wasn't dusk, dark, or late.
Okay.
You know, and we rode, you know, we just rode around. We rode around our dove field looking at how the corn was doing. He and I had planted corn in the dove field, and he planted the corn in the duck pond, and he was, you know, showing me how much better his corn was doing than mine was. And we rode around the duck pond. I mean, we just, you know, we rode the property.
Yes, sir.
You know, we rode the property. Then, you know, I mean, we rode around so much. We just rode. Probably. It was a good little while. It was more than 20 minutes or 30 minutes. Okay. And, you know, was it 2 hours? I don't know. I'd say it was more than an hour, probably.
Really wasn't keeping track of time?
And it wasn't, you know, it wasn't getting dark. Mama wasn't home yet. She had gone to a doctor's appointment. So, you know.
Yeah.
So, as you can see from the timeline, that's a pretty concise time period of when Alec and Paul, when they both got back home, how much time they could have been, quote, messing around on the property. I think it's clear they were, because we obviously have the Snapchat video of the tree with Alec by the tree, but it definitely wasn't as much time as Alec made it sound in his interrogation, or in his police interview. So what do you think? Okay, so number 2. This one's not going to be a surprise. This has been very much talked about throughout the trial, is the discrepancy of where was Alec between little after 8 and 9:06, during the time period when we know Paul and Maggie went down to the kennels. Where was Alec? So again, I'll start with, this time I'm actually going to start with Alec's testimony, and then we'll show you the timeline. What do you think?
And what did you do once Maggie and Paul left?
I stayed in the house.
Okay.
And I was watching TV, looking at my phone, and I actually fell asleep on the couch.
Okay. And what time did you?
You know, I
What
don't
time
know
did you wake up?
exactly what time I woke up, but when y'all get my phone, you know, I think one of the first things I did when I got up was call Maggie because I was going to my mom's. And I know I texted her because I checked my phone. And what time did we say the text was, Jim? Like 9:06.
I didn't see it.
Yeah, I got it written down from you.
I showed you the other night, didn't I?
Yes, sir. I got this.
So, you know, I texted her. So I called her just before that. And, I mean, she didn't answer at that point. And I left to go to my mom's.
Okay.
When you and Paul got back to the house, Miss Maggie's there, and y'all eat supper, which has been prepared. And you said you laid down and took a little nap. And when you got up, Maggie and Paul was gone, or did they leave when you laid down? Or before you laid down?
I believe that. I'm not sure.
But they weren't there when you woke up around the 9 o'clock mark or so when you made the call to Maggie to let her know you was going to your
No, nobody was in that house when I left.
So, and just trying to narrow down, the last time that you saw Paul and Maggie's when y'all were eating supper.
Yes, sir.
Up until you came back from your mom's and found what you found.
I mean, Paul and I were just knocking around up at the shop, the shed, the kennels, and just the whole property. And that was before dinner, yes, sir.
And you didn't go back down there after dinner until you returned trip from visiting your mother?
Yes, sir.
And then at 8:44:55, what does it reflect on Paul's phone?
This is when this video was extracted and created through Paul's phone, which shows Alex, Maggie, and, well, you can hear Alex, Maggie, and Paul in the background.
That's the kennel video at 8:44.
That's a kennel video that's been in previous testimony, correct?
Did the defendant repeatedly deny ever being at the kennels at that time period?
Yes, he did. Various interviews with law enforcement.
And was that kennel video, what time was that kennel video?
8:44.
And what time did Paul and Maggie's phones go silent forever?
8.
Several times.
Objection is overruled.
8:49 is when their phones went silent forever.
So I think it's going to be hard. Well, first of all, that's a lie. He was at the kennels. He was not sleeping on his couch at the house. Now, how the defense explains this, I don't know. I think this is probably some of the most some of the most harmful testimony against the defendant that the prosecution has. I think it's some of their strongest evidence, and I'm very fascinated to see how the defense handles this issue. So now turning to the third discrepancy that I found in the timeline, and this relates about how much time Alec was actually at his mother's house when he left Moselle at 9:06, and from the time he arrived at 9:22 to the time he left. There's very clear timeline testimony of how long he was there, but then we have this other testimony that's very disturbing. So here we go. We'll start with the timeline testimony, and then we'll insert some testimony that we heard a little earlier in the trial about this issue of how long Alec was actually at his mother's. So listen in.
Going to be at 9:22:39.
Close to the wood line in the outbuildings?
That'd be correct.
All right, and again, what time is the arrival at Alameda?
9:22:39. Represent at 9:43:18. This is when we first saw movement, and this would be Alex leaving Alameda en route back to 4147 Moselle Road. It's shown approximately 2 miles an hour.
All right, and the time again?
9:43:18.
The arrival time that you just testified?
That's correct.
What was the arrival time that you
9:22.
And he's leaving at what time?
9:43.
So approximately how long?
20 minutes.
Twenty minutes. 20 minutes. About 20 minutes.
Okay. Tell the jury about that, please.
He came in the room, you know.
Can you speak up, please, ma'am?
He came in the room and speak that, you know, spoke like he always do.
And what did he tell you?
That he was sitting at the house. He was at the house.
Say it again.
He was at the house.
And I'm not 100% following you. He was telling you or saying to you that he was at the house? When?
The night of the murders.
The night of the murders?
Yes.
What was he telling you about that he was at the house the night of the murders?
That he'd been there 30 to 40 minutes.
Was he telling you that? Did he ask you anything about that when he was talking to you? Did he indicate to you what he wanted you to do with that information?
No, no.
What did he say?
He just said that he was at the house for 30 to 40 minutes. That's it.
He said what? Was he there 30 or 40 minutes that night?
Not to my recall.
Why you?
Wow. So the caregiver's testimony is just devastating. I don't know. What do you think? So the fourth discrepancy, and this is one again that I think the prosecution already has and will continue to kind of emphasize in the rest of the case, is the discrepancy of the timing around the 911 call. So it's not that of when he made the 911 call. That's very clear. It was 10:06. But what the discrepancy is what was the time from when Alec arrived back from his mother's house, drove to the main house, and then realized realized Paul and Maggie weren't there, and then went back to the kennels, and what he testified as to what he did and how that related to what time he actually called 911. So again, I'll start with Alex's testimony first, and then I'll end with the timeline. So here we go.
Just start at the top, take your time.
Like when I came back here, I mean, I pulled up and I could see him, and, you know, I knew something was bad. I ran out. I knew it was really bad. My boy over there, I could see it was. And I ran over to Maggie, and actually, I think I tried to turn Paul over first. You know, I tried to turn him over, and I don't know, I figured it out. His cell phone popped out of his pocket. I started to try to do something with it, thinking maybe, but then I put it back down really quickly. Then I went to my wife, and I could see.
Did you touch Maggie at all?
I did. I touched them both.
Okay.
I tried to take, I tried to do it as limited as possible, but I tried to take their pulse on both of them. And, you know, I called 911 pretty much right away, and she was very good. I talked to her. I told her I was going to get off the phone to call some family members. I did that. And
And you, when you went back to the kennels, besides Maggie and Paul, did you see anybody, any cars?
I didn't see
Take
anything
your
right
time.
then, no, sir.
Take your time.
You know, I saw Maggie and I saw Paul laying down. I knew, you know, I didn't know, you know, I knew it was bad. I went over there and, you know, I saw it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I called 911.
Okay.
Next map's gonna be 10:05:57. And
What?
that's the arrival time at the kennels.
According to that GPS location data.
Yes, sir, from GM and OnStar.
What's that time again?
It's gonna be 10:05:57.
Down at the bottom of the page, what time is the 911 call?
10:06:14.
How many seconds is that from the time that the Suburban arrives at the kennels and he calls 911?
Roughly 20 seconds.
20 seconds?
That's correct.
Do you recall the defendant's statements to law enforcement shortly after the crime? That he went over and checked the bodies and that sort of thing?
I do.
What, if anything, in his statements to law enforcement did the defendant say about what he did when he arrived at the scene?
The defendant stated that he went and checked on Paul and Maggie to check the bodies.
From the moment the Suburban arrived at the kennels, how long did it take for that 911 call to be made?
Less than 20 seconds.
So I think the issue here, and it's a good one, is basically if you take Alec for what his word is, that means that he did all this checking of the bodies in 20 seconds. I don't know. And so the only thing is, which I suspect the defense will say, is that wasn't an exact, he was, you know, when he made those statements, he was under duress and, you know, he really didn't know exactly what was going on and he was in shock. And so the details may be a little fuzzy. I think that's what they have to say, something along those lines. So anyway, what do you think? Interesting. But as I mentioned, there's two things that the prosecution focused on that I don't think are going to be necessarily as important as maybe the prosecution thinks they might be, or at least how much emphasis they were giving when we heard the timeline testimony on Friday. So the first was a lot of the testimony about the average speeds that Alec was going from when he went to work in the morning of June 7th, when he left work to come back home, when he left the house to go to his mom's, and when he came back from his mom's back to Moselle that evening. So those 4 times, they basically, through the OnStar and GPS data, they were able to figure out how fast he was going. And they made a big deal about the fact that when he went to work in the morning, or actually early afternoon, his average speed was 65 miles an hour. And then when he came home that late afternoon, early evening, it was only 54 miles per hour on average. But then when he left the home at 9:06 to go to his mom's after the murders had occurred, according to the prosecution, his miles per hour were 74 miles per hour. And the average miles per hour when he came back from his mom's to Moselle was 80 miles per hour. And the insinuation is that he was going faster later because he was either trying to create an alibi or he was, you know, under duress because he had just committed these horrible murders. And in fact, they had testimony by the sled agent that said, you know, that he was an officer from that area, and he talked a lot about the conditions of the roads being at night. The officer testified that he would not go 80 miles an hour down that road at that time because it had, at the time of the murders in 2021, it hadn't been repaved, and it would be very dangerous to drive that fast because there's deer and et cetera in that area. But I think the defense could flip back and say, yeah, but it is at night. Both of these where he had a higher per speed was at evening, so less traffic, I guess. You know, people tend to drive faster at night than during the day. And then the other thing I think they could counterbalance with the area being with deer and the road conditions, etc. I think that you could counteract that testimony because the sled agent said, well, and I also use, what did he call it? What did they call that? Running code. When they do a running code, when they put the sirens on and they're making a lot of noise and the bright lights, and the sled agent even said, yeah, and sometimes that can even attract deer. So I think the defense could use that to say, well, Alec wasn't driving 80 miles an hour down this road because he doesn't have a cop car, and so he wouldn't have that concern, and he's from this area and he's used to driving that fast. So I think that was kind of like, I don't know that was that critical. There was a lot of testimony on that, and I'm not so sure that specific argument is going to really go anywhere. The other one that I think goes both ways is there was a lot of testimony about the various calls and how they weren't on the, quote, extractions from Alec's phone. So an extraction, again, from the phone is when they literally take off, like they basically make the copy of the phone. Remember, they were doing that when they interviewed Alex 2 days after the murders. They extracted his phone. So basically it would be like the call data, like what's physically on the phone. And they compared that to the cell phone data reports or the Verizon records, basically the independent records from the cell phone company, which obviously those would be accurate because that's the company that's providing the service. And they listed, in the timeline, all the instances where they were able to confirm that a call or a text was made because they had it from the other person's phone. So like they had the information extracted from either Paul or Maggie's phone or various people, or they got it from the Verizon records, but for whatever reason, it wasn't on the extraction that they took off of Alec's actual phone. So the insinuation is he's deleting a bunch of things from his call log, which it does seem he did. And there's a lot of them. I mean, it looked really bad. I mean, when I started taking notes, I'm sure I didn't get all of them, but there's over 20 here. I mean, starting from when you would expect someone to be kind of trying to create an alibi, if that's what this is for, is to show that there is an alibi creation, and therefore let's delete calls that don't go along with my alibi. But, so there were calls as early as 6:08. Paul had called Alec, and that wasn't on his call log. And then there was another call, and there was calls from a Jay Parker. Then there was a text from Paul, and then there was a call from Alex to Maggie. These are just all lists of various calls, and they range from 6:08 going on down to 7:03. There's a call from Maggie that again was not on his call records from his actual phone, but was in the information they got from Maggie's phone and from Verizon. So where I thought they're going with this is there's a ton of them that we heard about when he was leaving the property to go to his mom's house, and he was coming back from his mom's house to go to Moselle. There were a lot deleted. But when I re-listened to Alec's interview, the longer one that was 2 days after the murder, and even the night of the murder, he's telling the police, these are calls I made, these are calls I made, these are calls I made. And he even says, for example, on the 10th interview on June 10th, he even says, after I called 911, I called my brother Randy, I called my John Marvin, I called Buster's friend. And so he's telling the calls he's making, and some of them are the ones that have been deleted. So I'm not sure. I think that could go both ways. I mean, it did kind of come to me at first thinking, my first impression was, oh, this is part of this, creating an alibi. But then you also can look at it and say, but then there's an interviews where he's actually talking about these phone calls. So what do you think? Those are 3 areas I'm going to be looking to see how the defense does. There are other discrepancies in the timeline, but they're things that I think at the end of the day probably aren't that important unless the prosecution's going to wrap them all together and show like this is the huge web of lies. I don't know, that some of them might just be, kind of going down a rabbit hole, which isn't worth going down. But those 3 areas I talked about, of course, the Snapchat video, I think there's something to the lies about how long Paul and Alec were actually at the house and could have been messing around. And also, of course, the time of how long he was at his mom's house. I think that definitely goes to this idea that he was trying to create an alibi. And then finally, of course, this discrepancy of the time frame of what he did and didn't do. Did he touch the bodies? Did he actually do anything? And how that went with, the car saying that he came to the kennels and 20 seconds later he's calling 911. Well, he wouldn't have been able to, in 20 seconds, get out of his car and go check the bodies and then call 911. So something isn't right there. Maybe the defense will say, look, that was just the insanity of the moment and the tragedy of what he was dealing with, having just found his wife and son being killed in such a horrific way. So we'll have to see, but I don't know. Let me know what you think. Thanks again for joining. I've got a couple of other Murdaugh videos that I'm going to do this week that I have planned, but I really wanted to get this one done because I know that the defense is going to get back going in full earnest tomorrow, and I really wanted to have that out. So thanks again for joining, and I hope to see you in my next one. Bye.